Hey guys, it's time for some more Allis Chalmers Model C engine work. Really want to hook it back up to that sooner rather than later, so we got a lot to talk about. So today, as you can see, we're going to be working mainly on getting the bottom end all sealed up. First thing I've done here, other than cleaning all the parts up, is I have my rear oil seal soaking in some oil. But we'll get to that in a bit. First thing I want to talk about here is the governor. This is the one that came out of the particular machine we're working on, and it's got a few issues. First of which is when I took it apart, I lost one of these tiny little clips, but it's pretty standard governor. We all know how they work. Faster it spins, the more the weights fly out, the more they push on this plunger, and that helps control the throttle. So this one's in kind of pretty rough shape. The main bearing here, it's a little sloppy. It's still technically within spec. My first thought was I can take this apart and dust a little bit off of that surface and make a new bushing, and we'll be good to go. And I started looking at the rest of it. Nextly, we have the plunger, and this has a bearing in it, and see that's getting pretty loose. This is the part where I lost the pin. Next thing I did was take the weights off, because we have an issue with the weights as well. This right here is the surface that the plunger rides on, and significant amounts of wear there. That's actually inserted into the weight. It's peened over there, as you can see. This is a harder material than the rest of the weight itself, and it's got quite a bit of wear on that. So the gear itself, pretty good shape. Like I said, I could dust a bit off of there and make a new bushing for it. Front bushing isn't bad, but here's the deal. I gotta replace over half of it, or refurb over half of it, so the only way to get these weights that I've found so far is to buy a whole new unit. So it looks like I'm buying a whole new unit. But the good news for today is that the folks at Allis Chalmers were kind enough to make the hole for where the front cover for the governor goes is big enough that you can slide that guy right through. So we don't have to actually install the governor before we put the front timing cover on, which is good, because before we can put the oil pan on, we have to put the front timing cover and the rear seal retainer on. Now, we don't have to, but it will seal up better if we do. If you actually look in the manual, you can change your rear seal without dropping the oil pan, but you have to be careful because this is going to be sliding up under the oil pan gasket. But I'm getting sidetracked. As you can see, I got a whole bunch of parts here all cleaned up, ready to go, so we're going to start putting some stuff on the engine. One thing I know I got to work on is getting the camera closer to the action, so I'm going to try and work on that today. But the first thing we're going to do today is put the oil pickup and pickup tube into the block. So the pickup tube is just a regular old piece of pipe, and the pickup screws into the bottom. It's got a little mesh screen there. It's a friction fit in there, so start with that. Alright, so we're just going to start by threading the oil pickup pipe into the block. Next we put the pickup onto the end of the pipe. And we're going to want to have this good and snug, facing forward. With the front timing cover off, you can see how that sits in the oil pan. And you can see by how close it is to the bottom there why some of the parts might have been wearing out on this engine, because that was firmly embedded into the sludge that we pulled out of this oil pan. So based on some of the components we've already seen, we know this engine probably had some issues with oil flow, and based on the amount of sludge in the pan, like I said, it was definitely having a hard time getting fresh oil to the components, and that caused probably the wear we saw in the camshaft, some of the main bearings. Connecting rod bearings weren't horrible, but that's more of a splash lube system at that point, but more on that later. Next, we're going to put the front oil seal for the crankshaft into the front timing cover. The manual says that you want to have it protruding about 1/8 of an inch through the front of the cover, and taking a look at it on this seal, that means you're going to be pretty much flush with the back. So I'm doing it in the shop press here. I got a 36mm socket going around the outside. You could do it with a hammer too if you got some skill and patience. That right there is about what we're going for. Next, I'm going to put a thin layer of sealer on the block as well as the front timing cover, just to help it seal to the gasket a little bit better. Next up, gasket. And I'm going to put on the block here. We got the front wheel support dowel or bolts holding it up down here, as well as the dowels for the governor cover. Now this is the back side of the front timing cover. Up here is the thrust surface for the spring and plunger that go in the camshaft, as well as this cup that's welded on here, and then the main oil passage on this engine is the camshaft. So what's going to happen here is any of the oil that didn't squirt out through any of the holes along it to lubricate the camshaft and the connecting rod bearings and the main bearings is going to squirt out the end of the camshaft here and splash on this cup, and this will redirect it into the gears that are under the front cover. So I'm going to hit the center of that with some assembly lube, as well as the spring and the plunger. And then I'll apply oil to the front crank seal. And there's a pin in there. Keep this from going in too far. We put the spring in. And it's kind of hard to tell from the parts manual, but the notch of the plunger goes in first. And then we can put the front timing cover on. Just like that. We'll get some screws in there. So these 3 screws, along with this stud that's in the timing cover, is what's going to retain the governor when that goes on. So we're going to start with the screws that aren't retaining anything else. Once I get these three in, then I'll use some backups to tighten that down, as well as putting a spacer and the nut on there just to push that up against where it should be. Alright, front's pretty much sealed up. These three bolts are here to stay. These three are going to come out, and then as you can see I got these it's just 2 1/2-inch washers and a 3/4 inch nut in there so that I could put some pressure up top with those pedestal mounting screws. And it's a good thing I did, because you could see how much that sucked it in when I put the pressure on those. We can take those off once we get the oil pan on. You know, it'll be all good. Alright, here's our rear seal retainer all cleaned up. Here's our rear main seal that's been soaking. Just want to make sure it doesn't go in there dry, because crankshaft will tear it up pretty quick. So this bolts onto the back of the block with 6 bolts and fold over locks. And these I just made out of sheet steel, because you never want to reuse fold over locks. For all other questions regarding fold over locks, please refer to Squatch253. He's a big fan of these, and he's done a lot of videos about the best way to fold them over. Alright, so we're over at the engine assembly bench now, which is getting a little crowded with 2 blocks on it. But we've got the back end slightly elevated, sealer on our gasket surfaces, and we're going to just try and slip this guy on there. Alright, so seals on there. They can be pretty tricky. The big thing is just try and, if you're going to poke at it and prod at it like I was doing, try and use a dull tool so as not to shred that cork up. Another thing is we have to put the oil wick in yet. I don't have one yet, but the manual states to put the oil wick in, it's best to do it from this side anyway. So just as long as we get the oil wick before the flywheel, we'll be good. Alright, fold over locks, fold it over. This is always kind of fun to do. Here's the Model C block. Here's the D2 block. Bit of a size difference. Alright, and we are back on the stand. Just not nearly enough room to get back there to work on that rear seal. That's what we have the engine bench for. Anyway, last thing we're gonna do here today is the oil pan, and it just same thing we've been doing all day: sealer, gasket, sealer, and then that's about it. sealer, gasket, and sealer. Now we just put the oil pan on. Now the most satisfying part for me is just putting all the bolts in. So first and foremost is the stud that goes into the folded over part of our front timing cover. And again, a reminder here, sometimes that stud is welded to the front timing cover, so that makes it more difficult to do front crankshaft seal or getting behind the front timing cover, any of that stuff, without pulling the oil pan, because that stud can't be removed how we removed it here. Reminder, guys, that just because they didn't put torque specs on everything back in the day doesn't mean you should use unlimited torque. Tune in next time to see how we remove broken bolts. I'm just kidding, I won't make you guys suffer through that. We'll have that fixed by the next video. Anyway, last but not least is the drain plug. This bad boy's ready to get flipped over. Pretty much everything's on the top from here on out. You know what, guys? It's really starting to come together. We got the whole bottom end sealed up. Front sealed up, back sealed up. Oh, what should we do next time? We're probably still going to be waiting on parts for the governor. So we'll probably start working on the head. I've already got it cleaned up. I started pulling valve guides out. We'll probably... let's say next episode we'll do valve guides and maybe valves too. So stay tuned for that, and hope you guys have a good 4th of July weekend. It's time to celebrate, and hopefully you make it through to the end with all your fingers intact. So now I'm always shooting for. See you next time, guys.